just ran down the stairs. God, I'm unfit. Hello everybody, welcome back to Tom Reads Things. My name is Tom. I hope you are all super good. So today I thought I would talk to you about a book that I've just finished. It's taken me a month to finish. I've really enjoyed it, and it was great to get into this 1,000-page novel to really sort of immerse myself in the characters and the story of this wonderful, exceptional novel. So today I would like to talk to you about Dombey Son by Charles Dickens. So this book, for anyone who hasn't read it, don't worry, I won't give away any spoilers, is about a character called Mr. Dombey. He is a wealthy businessman living in London, and he has two children. He has a daughter called Florence, and he also has a son called Paul. And when Paul is born, unfortunately, their mother passes away during or just shortly after childbirth. Mr. Dombey is very happy that he has a son to carry on his business for him, Dombey and Son, but he is less close to Florence. He really kind of sees her as an inconvenience, really. He's not close to her at all. He does not regard her, hold her in any regard at all, due to her gender, really. The story sort of looks at his relationship with his children as they grow up, and the different characters they meet, and the different expectations that he has on his children. But for me, really, this story is really about kind of exploration of gender, obviously in Victorian era, but also the way that it's a fantastic exploration of parent and child relationships. This novel is absolutely chock-a-block with parent and child relationships. One thing you find in this book is that the way Dickens writes parent and child relationships, he writes them in this instance quite negatively. So there's lots of different parent-child relationships, as I said, and when you have those parent and child relationships, obviously we're all parents or children, and we know that parent-child relationships can sometimes be tricky, but he writes them really tricky, especially the biological parent and child relationships. He writes as very problematic, and he really explores the different difficulties that those relationships can go through with the expectations of the parents on their children, and also the different ways that parents can use their children for their own sort of financial or social advantage, really. There are parent and child relationships in this that are good, but they are the parent and child relationships that are not biological, interestingly enough. So for example, the character of Edith, her relationship with Florence it's kind of one of the first times where really, since she was a baby, that Florence has felt really cared for and really loved and had a kind of maternal figure, or even just a parent figure to look up to, really. And I really like the exploration of the kind of daughter-stepmother relationship that Florence and Edith have in this book. It's usually stepmother and child, or step-parent and child relationships in literature are kind of quite fraught, but they instantly have a very close bond, and I really, really like the way that Dickens writes those characters and the interaction between those two characters. Talking of characters, there are some fantastic characters in this book. I really, really, really love the character of Edith. The reason I think I love her so much is because of her ability to completely stand up to the men in her life, and also to her mother to some extent as well. You can tell that Edith's had quite a rough life. She's been used by her mother for her mother's own social advantage, and actually I think by the time we meet Edith in this book, she really has had enough of people taking advantage of her and using her and thinking that they're above her. There are some fantastic scenes in this book, especially where Edith is having confrontational scenes with either Mr. Dombey, her husband, or Mr. Carker, her husband's employee. So there are some fantastic scenes where Mr. Dombey is basically outlining his expectations of his new wife and what her role should be and how she should be incredibly submissive to him. And Edith just does not have any of it. She's like,
whatever, mate, not happening.
I really like her for that. And also Mr. Dombey, when he realises he's not going to get through to Edith, he sends Mr. Carker, who is Mr. Dombey's employee, to kind of do his dirty work. And he says to him, look, you've got to get Edith on side. She is going rogue. We've got to get her under the thumb. Go and have a chat with her about it. Obviously much more elaborate Dickensian writing than that. And Mr. Carker goes in all slimy and gross, and he is such a fantastic Dickensian villain, Mr. Carker. He's written perfectly, but he goes in to try and do Mr. Dombey's dirty work on behalf of him, and Edith is just, she stands up to him, and in the face of him saying to her, look, you absolutely have to do this, there is no other way, she's just like, no. And I really, really, really love that about Edith. It's really interesting to think how people in the Victorian era would have read her, whether they would have read her, I hope they would have read her, and I think they would have read her as a kind of good for you, Edith, good for standing up to these awful men, or whether, you know, if it was a man of a certain social status reading this in Victorian times, whether they would actually have sympathised with Mr. Dombey and been like, God, I feel really sorry for having for Mr. Dombey having a wife like Edith, who has her own mind and her own thoughts and her own, you know, her own drives and things like that. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about how that character of Edith would have been read depending on the sort of social historical context that you're reading it in. As I said, Mr. Carker is a fantastic villain. I really like the character of Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, because he's so slimy and just cringeworthy, and I think you see a reflection of him in Dombey Son, in the character of Mr. Carker. Mr. Carker is, as I said, Mr. Dombey's employee, and often goes on to do his dirty work. He has a lot of knowledge of Mr. Dombey's business, and Mr. Dombey trusts him implicitly, and because Mr. Carker just is a yes man, he does whatever Mr. Dombey says. That's how he's got to his position. So yeah, he's a really gross, disgusting character in this book, and I love him for that. Another really interesting character in this book is the character of Walter, or Waller, as he's written sometimes. So Walter is a young man who lives with his uncle, and his uncle runs a shop selling what I believe are sort of equipment and things for seafaring. The shop is not doing so well, so Walter gets a position at Mr. Dombey's business. And that's how he comes to, and he comes to know Florence as well. So one thing I think is really interesting about the character of Walter is that he actually only appears in the book for a very short amount of time, a relatively short amount of time considering the length of this book. However, a lot of the plot and the dependencies of the characterization and the emotions of the characters and the drivers of these characters sort of hang off of him as a character, especially around the character of Florence. A lot of her, you sometimes feel a lot of her drives are based around her relationship with and her friendship with Walter, even though, and so he seems to have a lot of impact on the plot and the characterization of certain characters, even though he himself is actually not in the book and is not heard from at all, really, for a huge chunk of this novel. So I find that really interesting. Another character that I sort of love to hate in this book is the character of Edith's mother. She's often referred to as Cleopatra, I think in reference to her sort of neediness and the fact that she sees herself as a bit of a grande dame and an empress, really. She is just so full of herself. Everything's about her. Everything is about how Edith can advance her social status and her sort of financial status as well. Everything is, you know, all about her, and she's very needy and very absolutely full of herself and self-centered. And I think Charles Dickens writes those sorts of characters so well. Everything is about them. And so even though she's really quite an awful character, she is actually really fun to read about. I love Charles Dickens' writing in this book. There is a very moving scene at the beginning of the book where Florence and Paul's mother dies, Mr. Dombey's wife dies, and the way that Charles Dickens writes death is just absolutely incredible and very, very moving for such, and it's within the first paragraph of the book, and it really kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book. You kind of understand that this is going to be one of Charles Dickens' more serious novels. There isn't so much of the there aren't so many really overly flamboyant and eccentric characters in this book that often pepper Charles Dickens' other works. And I kind of love it for that. I love those extravagant, flamboyant characters that you see in things like books such as David Copperfield and Nicholas Nickleby to an extent. But I also love the other side of Charles Dickens' writing, the sort of more, I don't want to call it mature, but almost serious sort of novels. And this is definitely, I feel, one of those. So yeah, he writes very moving scenes at the beginning of this book, and just made me fall in love with his writing all over again, really. So yes, those are my thoughts on Dombey Son by Charles Dickens. Do let me know if you've read this. Do let me know if you're planning to read it, potentially for Victober. And this will definitely fit into Katie's challenge, read a book over 500 words. God, look at it, it's 1,000 pages, if I haven't mentioned that already. So yeah, do let me know if you've read this, do let me know if it's on your TBR, or do let me know if you disagree with any of the things I've said, or what your thoughts are on it. I really look forward to talking to you about it in the comment section down below. So thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Thanks, bye.